In this episode, we focus on something that helps security architecture stop feeling like a pile of disconnected diagrams and start feeling like a disciplined body of work that other people can use, review, and trust. New learners often assume architecture is mainly about having good ideas. But in real organizations, the difference between good intentions and real progress is the quality of the work products, meaning the documents, models, decisions, and mappings that make the architecture understandable and repeatable. Two well-known methods that help bring structure are the Open Group Architecture Framework, TOGAF, and Sherwood Applied Business Security Architecture, SABSA. You do not need to memorize every formal term to benefit from them, because the value is in how they force you to think in layers and connect business needs to technical choices. When you use them well, you can explain what you are doing, why you are doing it, and how someone can verify it later without relying on your memory. That is exactly the kind of architectural maturity that makes audits, reviews, and project delivery smoother instead of more stressful. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A helpful starting point is to define what a work product is in the context of architecture, because people use the word loosely and beginners can end up producing artifacts that look impressive but do not actually support decisions. A work product is any persistent output that captures architectural thinking in a way others can consume, such as a set of requirements, a risk-driven set of security principles, a high-level design model, a decision record, or a mapping from controls to system components. The key idea is that a work product should reduce uncertainty for the next person, whether that person is an engineer implementing a feature, a leader deciding funding, or an auditor verifying compliance. Work products also protect the organization from drift, because when staff changes or systems evolve, the work product preserves the rationale for why things were built a certain way. Beginners sometimes think documentation is separate from architecture, but architecture is largely communicated through artifacts, and weak artifacts lead to weak security outcomes even when the ideas were solid. When you understand work products as tools for clarity, you stop producing documents for their own sake and start producing artifacts that make decisions easier and more defensible. Before we connect the methods, it helps to understand the common failure mode they are trying to fix, which is the gap between business goals and technical controls. Many security efforts begin with a requirement like protect sensitive data, but then jump straight to mechanisms without clarifying what the business actually needs, what risks matter most, and what success looks like. This creates confusion because different teams interpret the requirement differently, and the architecture becomes a collection of local choices rather than a coherent design. Another failure mode is producing diagrams that show what exists but do not explain why it exists, which makes them hard to use during trade-offs or audits. A third failure mode is creating security requirements that are too vague to test, leading to endless debate about whether something is compliant or secure enough. Both TOGAF and SABSA provide structure that reduces these failures by forcing traceability, meaning a visible chain from business needs to security requirements to design choices to evidence. When that chain exists, architecture becomes a navigable map rather than a set of opinions. The first method, TOGAF, is best understood as a way to organize enterprise architecture work so it produces consistent, reviewable outcomes rather than ad hoc diagrams. It emphasizes the idea that architecture has multiple domains and viewpoints, and that you move from understanding business needs to defining information and application structures to shaping technology and implementation considerations. The most practical benefit for a security learner is that TOGAF gives you a disciplined way to ask, what are we building? Why are we building it? And how does it fit into the organization's broader structure? It also encourages you to treat architecture as a life cycle, where you define a baseline, define a target, and then plan a path between them rather than assuming change will happen automatically. Beginners often underestimate how important that transition planning is, because even a great target design fails if no one can implement it in manageable steps. TOGAF helps keep security architecture connected to the broader enterprise picture, which matters because security outcomes often depend on shared capabilities like identity, logging, and governance that span many projects. SABSA is best understood as a security-focused method that starts with business needs and drives towards security services and controls through clear layers of reasoning. The key advantage for a beginner is that it makes security architecture feel less like a toolbox and more like a structured argument, where you can explain how a business requirement becomes a security requirement, how that requirement becomes a design pattern, and how that pattern becomes implemented controls. SABSA is especially helpful when you need to explain security work to non-security stakeholders, because it keeps the focus on business outcomes like trust, continuity, and accountability rather than getting stuck in technical jargon. It also strongly encourages a layered approach where you define concepts at a high level, then define logical structures, then define physical implementations, while maintaining traceability between layers. That layered discipline is what prevents security from becoming inconsistent across teams, because everyone can see the same chain of intent. Beginners sometimes fear methods like this will slow delivery, but when used well, the method speeds delivery by reducing rework and argument, since decisions are documented and traceable. SABSA is particularly strong at turning security into a set of structured requirements and services that can be reused. Now we connect them in a practical way by thinking of TOGAF as a broad organizing frame and SABSA as a security-focused lens that fills that frame with security meaning. An enterprise architecture program might already use TOGAF to structure business, application, data, and technology views, and security can either be bolted on awkwardly or integrated intentionally. When you apply SABSA inside a broader enterprise framework, security requirements and controls stop being side notes and start being traceable architectural elements. This combination helps avoid the classic conflict where security feels like an external audit function rather than a design discipline that supports business objectives. It also helps you produce work products that are consistent with enterprise architecture expectations, which makes it easier for leadership to adopt and fund security improvements. For example, a target architecture that includes identity improvements and logging improvements can be positioned as an enterprise capability plan rather than a set of isolated security projects. Beginners benefit from this perspective because it shows that security architecture is not an isolated specialty. It is part of how organizations design systems responsibly. When the methods reinforce each other, security work products become easier to align with real project planning and governance. One of the most important practical results of using these methods is that you learn to separate conceptual, logical, and physical thinking without mixing them into one confusing artifact. Conceptual work products capture what the system must achieve and what trust boundaries exist, using language that stakeholders can understand. Logical work products capture how responsibilities are divided, such as where authorization decisions happen, where monitoring occurs, and how data is classified and protected across flows. Physical work products capture where those logical elements live in real environments, such as which zones host which components and where enforcement is applied. The mistake beginners make is jumping to physical details too early, which leads to arguments about placements and implementations before the organization agrees on goals and constraints. TOGAF encourages disciplined layering across the enterprise, and SABSA reinforces layering for security specifically, which is why they are valuable together. When your artifacts stay at the right level, they are easier to review, easier to reuse, and harder to misinterpret. This layered clarity also improves auditability because auditors can see what requirements exist, how they were designed into the system, and where evidence should appear. Another central benefit is building traceability into your work products so that security does not feel like a set of arbitrary rules. Traceability means you can point from a business driver to a security objective, from that objective to a control strategy, from that strategy to an implementation pattern, and from that pattern to the evidence that proves it is operating. In practice, this often looks like a clear mapping between requirements and architecture components, along with decision records that explain trade-offs and constraints. TOGAF's emphasis on baseline and target states helps traceability because it frames changes as deliberate transitions rather than random upgrades. SABSA's security-focused layering helps traceability because it demands a clear story of why a control exists and what risk it addresses. Beginners sometimes worry traceability is just for auditors, but it is also for engineers and operators because it prevents confusion about what is mandatory and why. When traceability is strong, it becomes easier to prioritize work and easier to defend decisions during review boards or incident investigations. Traceability is not a single document. It is a quality of the entire set of work products. Work products also need to support governance, which is the way an organization makes decisions, assigns responsibility, and ensures consistency over time. A method-driven approach encourages you to define who owns the architecture, who approves exceptions, and how architecture is reviewed as systems change. In enterprise contexts, governance is often where security succeeds or fails, because without governance, even well-designed patterns drift as teams make local changes. TOGAF supports governance by emphasizing architecture as an ongoing practice with defined processes and checkpoints, not a one-time design workshop. SABSA supports governance by defining a structured way to express security requirements and services that can be reviewed against business needs and risk statements. For beginners, the key is that governance is not bureaucracy for its own sake. It is how an organization ensures that security outcomes remain true after the initial project launches. A good work product makes governance easier by making decisions explicit and by defining what evidence shows compliance with architectural intent. When your artifacts are usable in governance conversations, security becomes a predictable part of delivery instead of a last-minute argument. To make these methods practical, it helps to think about the kinds of security work products you would produce during a real project and how each method shapes them. Early in a project, you might produce a business context statement, a set of security objectives tied to business drivers, and a high-level threat and risk summary that explains what matters most. As the design matures, you might produce a trust boundary model, a logical view of identity and authorization responsibilities, and a monitoring and evidence model that explains what must be logged and why. You might also produce decision records for major trade-offs, such as whether a service should expose an interface publicly or be isolated behind tighter boundaries, including the rationale for the chosen approach. TOGAF helps ensure these artifacts fit into the larger enterprise view, such as how the system interacts with shared platforms and how it moves from current state to target state. SABSA helps ensure the security elements are grounded in business requirements and are expressed in a way that supports assurance and auditability. The result is not more paperwork, but more usable documentation that reduces rework and confusion. Beginners can succeed here by focusing on clarity, traceability, and the right level of detail. A common misconception is that adopting a method means following a rigid template, but the real skill is tailoring the method to the organization while keeping the discipline intact. Tailoring means you choose the minimum set of artifacts needed to reduce uncertainty and support decisions, rather than producing every possible document. Discipline means you still maintain layering, traceability, and clear ownership, because those are the qualities that make the method valuable. If you tailor by dropping traceability, you lose the main benefit and end up with unstructured artifacts again. If you tailor by skipping conceptual clarity, you may build physical designs that satisfy one stakeholder but fail another because goals were never aligned. The right approach is to keep the reasoning chain visible while adjusting the form to fit the organization's maturity and pace. This is especially important in cloud environments, where systems change quickly and architecture must support rapid delivery without losing control. A method should be a stabilizer, not a slowdown, and it becomes a stabilizer when it produces artifacts that teams actually use. The cloud context also changes how you apply these methods because responsibility is distributed and shared services shape security outcomes. In cloud environments, enterprise scope often includes baseline identity integration, standardized logging and evidence flows, and platform guardrails that workloads inherit. A structured method helps you define where the platform ends and where workload teams must take responsibility, which prevents gaps created by ambiguous shared responsibility. TOGAF helps you describe the enterprise and platform target states and plan the transition in a way leadership can fund and sequence. SABSA helps you express security services like identity assurance, monitoring, and data protection as business-relevant requirements that can be measured and audited. Beginners sometimes think cloud security is mostly about choosing the right settings, but in architecture terms, it is about defining consistent patterns and evidence flows that survive constant change. A method-driven work product set makes cloud security less fragile because it documents baseline expectations and makes deviations visible. When auditors ask how you ensure consistency across many workloads, structured artifacts provide a coherent answer. The methods help you make cloud security feel like engineered discipline rather than constant firefighting. Another major value of structured work products is that they make reviews and trade-offs more productive because they give reviewers a shared reference and a shared vocabulary. Without structure, a security review becomes a debate where people argue from personal experience and local concerns, and decisions can swing based on who speaks loudest. With structured artifacts, reviewers can evaluate whether the design meets defined objectives, whether controls are traceable to requirements, and whether evidence flows exist for critical outcomes. TOGAF encourages this by promoting consistent views and lifecycle thinking, which helps reviewers compare current and target states. SABSA encourages this by tying security decisions to business drivers and risk statements, which helps reviewers focus on what matters rather than on trivia. For incident scrutiny, structured work products also become invaluable because investigators can quickly see intended trust boundaries, expected logging, and ownership responsibilities. Beginners may not yet have lived through a stressful audit or incident, but the point is that structured artifacts reduce confusion when time is short. When your work products support COM review, you have designed architecture that is easier to govern and easier to defend. The final skill to emphasize is that these methods help you build a reusable architecture practice, not just one project's documentation, because reuse is how organizations scale security. Reuse means patterns and decisions can be applied consistently across many systems, such as a standard approach to segmentation, a standard approach to privileged access, and a standard approach to evidence retention. TOGAF supports reuse by keeping architecture aligned to enterprise capability planning, where shared services can be built once and consumed broadly. SABSA supports reuse by defining security services and requirements in a way that can be applied across contexts while still being traceable to business needs. When reuse is real, delivery speeds up because teams spend less time debating fundamentals and more time implementing within clear guardrails. Reuse also strengthens security because consistency reduces gaps, and auditors gain confidence when controls are applied predictably. Beginners sometimes think architecture is mostly about new designs, but much of architecture is about establishing stable patterns that reduce future effort. Methods make that stability easier to achieve because they provide a disciplined way to capture and communicate patterns. To conclude, applying TOGAF and SABSA to structure security architecture work products is about turning security architecture into a coherent, layered, traceable practice that survives change, review, and scrutiny. TOGAF helps you place security work inside a broader enterprise architecture discipline, connecting current and target states and making change planning realistic and governable. SABSA helps you keep security grounded in business needs and risk realities, translating those needs into structured security requirements, services, and evidence expectations. Together, they encourage layered thinking, clear scope, and strong traceability so your artifacts are usable by engineers, leaders, and auditors rather than being decorative diagrams. They also help prevent the common failures of vague requirements, inconsistent controls, and unprovable security claims, which are exactly the issues that cause painful audits and fragile systems. When you use these methods as discipline guides rather than rigid templates, you produce work products that clarify decisions, support accountability, and make security a reliable part of how the organization builds and operates systems.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.